Well, good afternoon, good morning, or good evening, depending on where you are in the world, and welcome to today's DevOps.com webinar. I'm Charlene O'Hanlon, managing editor at DevOps.com and moderator for today's event, and I welcome you. Before we get into today's webinar, which promises to be a really great one, we do have a few housekeeping items to go over. First of all, today's event is being recorded, so if you miss any or all of the event, you'll be able to access it on demand. We'll be sending out a link to the webinar on demand afterwards, so you can just click on the link and get right to it. Secondly, we are taking questions from the audience. So if you have a question for either of our panelists today, please don't hesitate. Use your GoToWebinar control panel, type in your question, and we'll take a few minutes near the end of the webinar to go over the audience questions. Okay, I am not driving the slides today. Ben, my producer, is my trusty slide pusher. So Ben, could I have the next slide, please? There we go. Our panelists today, look at those faces. We've got Carl Levine, who is Senior Technical Evangelist at NS1, and Anand Akela, Vice President of Product Marketing at Tricentis. Welcome, gentlemen. Thank you so much for joining me today.
Thank you, Charlene.
Thanks, Charlene. Glad to be here.
All right, great. Well, I am really excited about our discussion for today's webinar, which is, I actually didn't even introduce this. It is continuous testing, a panel discussion, and you guys are my panelists. So thank you very much for joining me. Ben, could I have the next slide, please? Okay, today's webinar is actually being kind of loosely based on an ebook that we just produced here at DevOps.com, 6 tips for a successful continuous testing environment. The ebook is going to be available on DevOps.com for download, and everyone who attends today's session or signs up for today's session will also receive a download link to the ebook following the webinar. Okay, let's go ahead and get right into the discussion. Ben, could I have the next slide, please? Okay, continuous testing versus test automation. What's the difference? Now, this is something that we started the ebook with, and it's kind of an interesting topic if you kind of sit back and think about it. But they are not the same thing. And what I really want to do is kind of get you guys talking about maybe some of the differences between continuous testing and test automation, and really why folks should not be thinking that they are one and the same. So Anand, do you want to go ahead and kick that off and kind of talk a little bit about why the two are different?
Sure. Before I talk about why it's different, let's kind of look at test automation. It's been there for some time, for many years. Different vendors have been offering solutions for test automation. But if you look at what's there in the marketplace, as some of these analysts and surveys suggest, that we still have 80% of the tests done manually. The test automation solutions have been there for quite some time, but still manual testing is pretty close to 80%, depending on which survey you look at. So that means, automation has barely reached, 15 to 20%. And there's a reason, because the test automation, the way we have been doing, is not necessarily kind of meeting the requirements. People automate and then kind of get into multiple problems, like when they have new functionality come in, they have to update the test scripts and so on, get into maintenance trap, they start getting false positives, and they go back to manual testing. So the continuous testing, on the other hand, the idea is to do testing early on, do in parallel to development. It has definitely test automation is a key part of it, but not test automation is itself not sufficient, because we have seen in the last many years we still at 80% manual testing. So the differences that we see for continuous testing in 3 areas. We have not been looking at risk. So it's very important, especially now in the world of Agile and DevOps, when the development teams are building software really fast, you really need to understand and answer a question. Is this release candidate has acceptable amount of risk before deploying into production? You need to understand what risk you have, what risk it is covering. If you have, close to 100% risk or 80% risk, depending on your how much risk you want to really take. You need to have that information, and based on that, you can decide, you can take a decision whether we should deploy this in production or not. Otherwise, it will have impact on end user experience, your brand equity, and so on. So that's one key difference that we see, that you really need to kind of understand the business risk. Second area that we see that typically test automation has focused on UI, the functional testing of UI, web UI primarily, mobile, and API to some extent. So web and API. In this world where distributor applications are becoming more and more important, APIs are still very, very important, and we see that automation to go higher in the API side of the world. But it's not only web and API, it's also the middleware, the backend, the SAP, the Salesforce, the Workday. Enterprise need to deliver a service, and the service cuts across different components, starting from the web or mobile to the middleware to the backend and to the infrastructure. And you really need to test the entire breadth. So having a coverage of a pretty good diverse set of technology is pretty good. And then finally, time. Time is, the development teams are building software so fast. If you have a test automation solution that are not, that adds more, to the time, that is adding more to kind of time to testing, it's not optimal. So you need to have a really good time to market to support, to complement the speed that we gain from the fast delivery from Agile and DevOps. Let me just pause there and see if Carl, you want to add anything.
No, I would certainly agree with everything you've said there, Anand. Just in terms of, the way applications are built and delivered today, there are more, cross-functional dependencies, cross-vendor, different clouds, different, services that exist that are behind APIs. And yeah, it's true, the middleware, does play a massive role in this. And so being able to, have functional and unit tests in place as applications are built to ensure that those connections are, solid, especially if, additional context around a certain process or, other piece of information, comes from a third-party system, you want to make sure that as you're, making changes to core functionality in an application, that all of those pieces still work together and that you won't be in for any ugly surprises when you go to deploy. So yeah, spot on.
So, you actually, both of you brought up, some really interesting things. And, one of the things was the fact that, obviously we've got the middleware that we need to worry about, but, is this something that's kind of new as far as maybe the processes are concerned? I mean, have people just kind of focused on test automation and not really thought about the continuous testing until more recently, or is this something that's just kind of always been there, but nobody's ever really addressed it?
It's been there. Test automation has been there, but the continuous testing is becoming more important now because testing is becoming a really bottleneck, right? Mm-hmm. Because of the Agile and DevOps, you hear about software being earlier. We used to kind of have a release every year. Large enterprises used to do kind of on a yearly releases. They used to go kind of change the upgrade on a yearly basis. Then, they started going down to quarterly, monthly, and now you hear stories about releasing every few seconds. So what that means is that if the development teams are building software and ready to deliver really quick, you need to be in a position to test it and have the point I made earlier. You really need to understand the risk of the release candidate before deploying to the production. And for that, you need to test early. You need to kind of shift left and start doing things that typically people did after all the work was done in that traditional waterfall model. You need to start doing those earlier. The unit test, the functional test, the load test, all these different testing, as well as the static code analysis and the security testing and so on early on and in parallel to development, so that you catch the problems early when it is easier and cheaper to fix, rather than finding it in production when it impacts the end users, and it could cost a lot, not only kind of in terms of downtime, but also the brand, the user experience, and so on.
Okay, Carl, do you have anything you want to add to that?
Yeah, I think that you mentioned waterfall in there, and one thing that I think that we're obviously dealing with today versus even as recently as 5 or 10 years ago, applications are no longer monolithic. We went from a world where there were very few external dependencies in a piece of software. For instance, you'd get your yearly release of Microsoft Word for your computer, but it'd rely on a few like different Microsoft internal APIs on a computer, on an actual end user device. Now we're in this world where dependencies exist on the internet. They are out in the cloud. They're out in different data centers or different availability regions, and being able to ensure that as you're making these changes, for the companies that are doing multiple releases a day versus quarterly or monthly or even yearly, making sure that the connections to those systems remains as solid as possible is part and parcel of the entire experience. And I think that continuous testing certainly lends its sort of process to that. Without continuous testing, the ability to have confidence in the software candidate that's being released, that confidence rises exponentially as the depth, not necessarily the breadth, but making sure that all the pieces work. That is the goal in all this.
Mm-hmm. Okay, all right, great. Ben, could we push ahead to the next slide, please? Okay, so obviously with continuous testing, that's kind of changing the way we're viewing testing, and companies, to make it successful, companies need to change the way that the testing is perceived and performed, and that includes kind of opening the testing up beyond QA to the developers, and it's got to be now part of their CI/CD processes. And obviously the goal is to have as much of that testing occur in parallel with development, and that includes the unit testing, integration testing, system testing, security testing, performance testing. All of that needs to happen within that development in parallel to the code development. So guys, what am I missing here as far as kind of the high points of continuous testing and really what companies need to do to make sure that it is successful within their organizations?
All right, so I would say that just in my experience, just from I always preface this conversation with saying I'm a recovering product manager. It depends. If you're taking a legacy piece of software and modernizing that, say for instance, there's a ERP system or some kind of piece of software that's involved with running a business or doing whatever. You really can't take that piece of software offline. So any changes that are made are going to be incremental, to whatever code base is being used, and then pieces and parts are kind of farmed out to different resources instead of being monolithic. So in the case of that, being able to start taking bits and pieces away, as the agile model, takes over for what may have been developed in a waterfall model. It's breaking out the different components that make up a piece of software, and then understanding what can be done to actually accelerate the development while not incurring additional tech debt. And this may be writing an API or writing a service that talks to a legacy backend, or some kind of situation like that, where the software is already written, it's already doing its thing, but the new version will have to be slowly transitioned out to, and then code updated in the application. Whereas in a greenfield development, where say this is a brand new product, say this is like a some brand new startup that says we are going to go do X, Y, and Z with this piece of software that we're deploying in the cloud, and we're going to use these cloud resources, we're going to put certain assets in a CDN, we're going to do this, that, and the other thing. When they're writing that code base, when they're actually doing the development of the code, building the tests alongside it should be part of the scope of that work. It's no longer about just writing a piece of software to do something. The minimally viable product today should include not only a plan for continuous testing to ensure that the software is always resilient to whatever happens. If a backend disappears, is it able to ascertain state from a previous condition, or is it able to scale if it needs more capacity? So the tests should always be built in parallel with the code wherever possible, unless of course it is updating something of a more vintage nature.
Okay, great point. Anand, is there anything you'd like to add?
Yeah. I mean, I was looking at the ebook as well, and Diego, who's analyst, and he talks about it's a big mindset shift, right? So it's not only kind of doing the software development in silos, that the way you used to do it. Like developers did development, threw it over the wall, the QA guys did the testing. Quality should become everyone's business. Everyone should be a stakeholder when it comes to software quality, whether it's a developer, ops guy, DevOps person, whatever their role is. If they are involved and if they are a stakeholder in software development lifecycle, quality should be their business. So that's kind of one important thing, kind of mindset shift.
Mm-hmm.
In addition, and Carly, you talked about as enterprises are breaking their monoliths into microservices and distributing it, like it's distributed everywhere. Things need to be done a little bit different, right? I mean, you cannot wait until your whole monolith, the complete application is ready, and then you start testing, right? You need to start testing those individual services, right? Because they're distributed and microservices and different development teams are working on it, rather than like a siloed development team and QA team and so on. So it becomes in this, the way the architecture is changing, we need to change mindset as well as the way we have been doing things. Performance testing, for example, earlier we used to test it after everything is done. We tested the performance. Now that the web services are distributed, broken into individual smaller microservices, you really need to test them independently as they are done, as they're developed. And also technologies like service virtualization should be employed there, so that if you do not have the entire integrated, completely complete web service ready to test, you should be able to come up with the virtual services and test against that, so that your individual service can send the request to the virtual service and get the response back and complete the testing early on.
Absolutely.
So it's completely different mindset that you need to think of when it comes to continuous testing.
Okay.
Yeah, mock services, a mock API server. I mean, these are all things that you can get today. As you go to like a Swagger or a tool like that, where you can actually build an API service, to be a mock server for testing. That's this is the world we live in now, where we're not going to go and try and test this against production until we're ready, but we'll definitely do our best to make sure that everything that leads up to that watershed moment is taken care of.
All right, great. Well, I do want to remind the audience, we will be taking questions. So if you have a question for either Carl or Anand, please go ahead and use that control panel. And the ebook, the title of the ebook mentions the 6 tips. So we're going to dive right on into the first tip, and we'll go through all of them. But the first one is select your tools carefully. And obviously this is kind of broad, but you want to think about integrating with your IDE, and you want to be able to get continuous metrics. You want to have tools that enable API level testing, support mobile, hybrid, native environments, be capable of addressing the technical, not just the technical and developer roles, but the business roles as well. And then obviously, open source is always a good thing. So,
love me some open source.
What else, what beyond those that I listed, what do you guys, what are your thoughts on the tool selection in general? What are some of the things that folks really, really need to think about, keep in mind? Carl, you want to go first?
Yeah, I would just say make sure that it covers every aspect of what you're doing, especially IDE level. Now we're in a world where a few different programming languages could actually be used to build a piece of software. You might have one team working in Go, you might have another working in Python. You just want to make sure that your test coverage is there for all of the different situations that you're running up against.
Okay, Anand, do you have any thoughts there?
Yeah, of course. I have a lot of thoughts here.
Great. I figured, yeah.
No, definitely. Tool selection is important. You need to look at, as you are doing continuous testing, we are talking about doing testing in parallel, not waiting for the complete integrated build is ready for testing. So you need to kind of think about unit testing, functional testing, performance testing, security testing. So you need to have tools for different things, and you also need to look at what kind of tools you have for planning and stories. For example, if you have Jira or Rally, you need to have integrations with those. So you need to have a tool that could integrate with those. It could take possibly those story and create automated tests from there, or create requirements and uses that story to build test cases. You also need to kind of look at when the test cases are designed, you need to have a way to kind of design the test case and look at the risk associated with that, and based on that, prioritize those test cases so that at the end of the release, when you're ready for deploying the release candidate, you are able to answer the question that I talked about: is this release candidate have acceptable amount of risk? So you need to have that. You also need to look at, I talked about service virtualization, right? So you need to have tools that can give you virtual service that allows you to provision a virtual service that you could use to test early on in earlier part of the development, integration, and the staging environment, pre-production environment, and so on before you do the final system integration test. So you need to have that. You should also think about test data management, right? It is important to have test data because, like we talked about what's different in continuous testing. One of the things was time, right? You need to be able to, and as many of you will know that it takes a long time to really find the right kind of data to test. It's really important to have the test data ready on demand when you're doing the testing early in life cycle, as well as the system integration test. And the tests could be, created. Test data could be created based on the test design that you have. But at sometimes you will also need to look at the production data and subset them, anonymize them, mask them, and have that data ready for you to test. So given in this world when we are looking at the security compliance rules, GDPR, you really need to make sure that you are using a test data that in a secure way, which is compliant to the regulation. So, and then, once you're done with that, you need to look for performance testing. You need to understand you could use your existing scripts that you're using, but you need to distribute. As I talked about earlier, people are breaking monoliths into microservices and distributed all over the world. You really need to test them from with a load that is coming from different parts of the world. So you need to look at all of that. And again, security testing, you need to look at tools that allows you to look at the static code analysis early in the life cycle, look at the security, the dynamic part when it's running later on, look at the code and see if there's any security flaws early in the life cycle. So you need to look at all of these. You could, depending on your business needs, you could look for the tools that are best of the breed, but you could also look at a platform that kind of puts all of them together so that you have one unified platform to address many of these functionalities that I talked about. But that platform should also be open. It should be able to integrate with Jira, with Jenkins, with different tools, the open source tools. So as depending on your business needs, if you are using a certain tool for certain functionality, you should not be really kind of get stuck. That platform should be open and ready for integration with all the different tools that we're using in this world of DevOps, CI/CD, or performance and security testing.
Okay, great. Doing a quick time check. We're about 20.
Halfway there.
Yeah, we're halfway there. So next one, pay attention to how testing is automated. And I think this is something that people kind of don't think about because, they just figure, well, they can just automate all their tests and live happily ever after. But too much testing also, can lead to brittle tests, and that's not good for any environment. And and I will tell you that 6 ways to Sunday, humans cannot be replaced in this area. They have to test for certain things like the user experience. I mean, machines cannot measure human experience. So
that is correct.
Certain things that you really, really need to keep in mind when you are looking at automating the testing. And Carl, you're chomping at the bit for this one, I can tell. So
yeah, absolutely.
Okay.
So,
go ahead.
Yeah, I definitely agree with you. There's a diminishing rate of return when it comes to testing everything, and writing a test for everything, and relying on automation to do the job of what humans have been doing since I would say the advent of time. I mean, before there was software, there was definitely hardware, and it definitely was not a computer. I mean, think of machinery in factories hundreds of years ago or things like that. I mean, had to make sure these things worked, and people were part of that. So automating quality control is something that has only been in our recent history as a people. So I think that it's really important that when a project is scoped, or when the groundwork is being laid for anything that's being developed, that it is set early on, who is responsible or what is responsible for ascertaining the quality or the functionality of a given piece of code. So yeah, to your point, user experience, as much as AI and machine learning have come to the forefront in recent years, I am a staunch believer in the fact that people will always be a part of the process of making sure that it feels nice, that the piece of software you're using will handle errors gracefully, and that you will not be confused by any sort of output that is not expected, for
Mhm.
instance, or that that using the software isn't clunky, that you're not jumping ahead one step to go back and do something over again, in a linear process. So yeah, I'm in complete agreement with everything you just said, and I would interested to hear what Anand has to say about this as well.
Absolutely.
Yeah, I mean, agreed. It's really important to look at how you're automating the test. You need to look at the maintainability, so that the tests are, it could use it for a longer time without any problem. Human interventions are still important, so I don't believe that all the manual tests will completely change to automated test. We believe that at least the way we are thinking, our vision is that if we just turn this 20-80 ratio, like 20% automated, 80% manual, to the other way, kind of 80% automated and 20% manual, but do it in a way a little bit different that we call exploratory testing by subject matter experts, the people who are experts of those applications. They test using a technique or methodology called exploratory testing, where the next step of testing is based on the observation and what happens in the previous step. So I think that's where the subject matter expert and human will be very, very important in addition to automated testing.
Okay. All right.
No, that's a valid point. I mean, in a previous life, I worked for another internet infrastructure company, and I was product manager for a massive chunk of the product that they made, and I spent a lot of my time reviewing changes personally, as they came out, because who else on the team had that kind of expertise that wasn't sending it out to a customer, it wasn't sending, so it'd be like myself and maybe some guys from tech support that would go and test everything and look for those edge cases and see what we could try and break, essentially. So
Mm-hmm.
yeah, the human part still is as relevant today as it has ever been.
Well, I think you just made a lot of people really happy by saying that. So
Your jobs are safe,
your
everybody.
jobs are safe. All right, let's go ahead and move on to the next slide. The next step is just to be diligent when you're adding new tests. I mean, not everything needs to be tested. We just went over that, but if you have too many tests, you could actually dilute or negate what you've done in the past. So you need to kind of choose your tests carefully, and then obviously you need to test your bug fixes too. You can't just throw something in and expect that it's not going to be tested and work fine in the wild. And then don't ignore errors that you get during testing, because all you're doing is introducing more errors, and you can't just say, oh well, that test is always broken, so we're just going to ignore that. You're not helping anybody by doing that. So these are some of the things that you really want to be thinking about when you do add tests. And what do you guys think? Anything else?
Yeah, this is really a point that I've seen so many times that,
Yeah.
like we talk about false positive, right? Like people
Mm-hmm.
look at the errors and say, oh, this is not necessarily an error. So they just kind of start ignoring those. And then all the automation they have done is like they just kind of leave it and kind of do whatever they want and kind of practically go back to manual testing. So it is very, very important to look at how you automate and what do you have to do to maintain those tests. Otherwise, people just leave those and people don't kind of trust the test cases. So one of the challenges that we have seen in this world is in the test automation side is that ultimately a lot of the tools that are being used are they use at the end of the automation, they generate the scripts. And those scripts are great when you start the automation the first couple of times, but as you add new tests, as you add new functionalities, you need to kind of maintain that. And it becomes almost a full-time job to maintain those scripts. So kind of looking for solutions that are model-based, where you don't have to really maintain those scripts forever becomes important as well. You should look at solutions where you have to really get out of that helps you get out of the maintenance trap, so that you have the test, your automated test cases are there, and you can trust that the results are good and it's not false, and you trust them and use them as an ongoing basis.
Okay, great. Carl, do you have anything to add to that one?
No, that's spot on.
All right then. Okay, so looks like we moved on to the next slide already. So treat security issues like quality issues, and that is, it's kind of the obvious things. When you're speeding to delivery, sometimes security issues just get overlooked, or the concerns, they kind of push it under the rug. We'll deal with it later, but
Tech debt.
yeah, there's something, it's actually in the ebook that I thought was really fascinating. So I'm just going to read it to you guys and then let you do your thing. It says DevOps enables you to release features and fixes faster than ever before. So use that to your advantage to fix security bugs and vulnerabilities before they wreak havoc on your application. I think that is the mindset companies need to get into when they're thinking about security and testing and continuous testing. What do you guys think?
Therein lies the challenge.
Yeah, exactly.
So, the agile mindset has been with us for a short time in the grand scheme of all things business around software. Companies have been writing software for 40 years plus. I mean, we evolved out of punch cards into code, into where we are today, over the course of that time. And it never ceases to amaze me. Just where I've been in this industry and like what I've seen, what I've experienced, how quickly a security concern, or like just even the notion of building security into a product, will be dropped from the scope in order to meet an arbitrary deadline.
Mm-hmm.
And in agile, there is no real deadline. There's milestones, there are stories, there's epics, there's all these various time quanta that are thrown out there. And all too often we've seen security issues just get pushed down the stack because they want to get to a minimally viable product. My argument in all this, and I would hope that we would all kind of agree here, is that there should be no sort of compromise when it comes to security. We're now living in a world where we hear about breaches, we hear about all these the doom and gloom of running these applications out in the cloud and running things as a distributed service, and vulnerabilities, 0-day attacks. I mean, the list goes on.
Mm-hmm.
There is no reason whatsoever security should ever be dropped from scope. It should be considered just as fundamental as the code itself that is being written.
I agree. Anand, what do you say?
No, I mean, right now, I don't have anything to add. Carl and Charlene, you have a good point. It's really important, and I think I'm looking at the ebook, one of the code, a mature organization fails the build if the security tests don't pass. Pretty much, it kind of summarizes what we're talking about here.
Yeah. Let's see. All right, great. Well, I'm glad we're all on the same page with that one, because I think I'm with you, Carl. I think too many organizations just kind of overlook security in favor of getting their minimum viable product out. So, so I think we really need to stop treating it like the redheaded stepchild. So.
Yes, and I mean, and that's a function of organizational, change and organizational maturity. A company that understands that, security should be as much, considered as important as the, product itself. They're going to be the ones that ultimately, aren't, getting into a bit of hot water when, they go and release something and then like 3 days later somebody's, siphoning data out of the thing and doing nefarious things.
Right.
So,
right.
the whole goal here is to ensure that, and this comes down to brand reputation. This comes down to the ability to sell a product. I mean, I've seen situations where a company will, base their quarterly bookings or revenue on a product that is yet to be released. And then it gets down to the wire and they're like, well, we either have to choose to have this product out on time or to have it be safe. And
Right.
I was always the guy who was saying it needs to be safe. You know what? We'll make up the money somewhere else. Because ultimately the risk of what, a breach or any sort of, negative thing that could, occur from, security being, lower priority will far outweigh and far outstrip any potential revenue that a product could possibly bring or any future revenue that it could bring.
Right.
And ultimately, at the end of the day, a company is in business to make money. And, being risk averse in this case means, maybe pushing a product release a few days. Your revenue officer might be a little disappointed, but, not as disappointed as they'd be if, they got slapped with a, several $1 million lawsuit for, having lost people's personal data.
Exactly.
Yeah.
Okay, we got 2 more to go, so I'm going to go ahead and push on forward. Ben, next slide, please. Build human intelligence into the CI/CD pipeline. This is, we very briefly touched on this, but this is basically, you can't just, turn on automation and expect it to, interpret test results or certify that applications are secure and performing well and don't have any defects. So just real quickly, you guys have anything to add or any insights that you want to provide on this particular topic?
So I think we talked about some of this in the early on, but analyzing the risk when you're designing the test cases, understanding, I think the people who understand the application could help identify which feature, which part of the code that we are testing has what kind of risk, how important is that, either manually or kind of manually assigning it in the stories in Jira or Rally, if it is kind of pulled from there. So that's kind of manual, the human intelligence is required. In addition, once you have that, once the tests are executed and you have the risk profile, risk data, analyzing that and answering the question, I'll kind of bring that question again because I think that's very important. That does this release candidate have acceptable amount of risk? So answering that question, I think looking at the risk, that data, risk profile of your release candidate, and taking that decision and pushing the button should still be, I think, it's something that human could take a decision there based on the data and the risk analysis done by software or manually.
Okay. All right, great. So let's go ahead and move on to the final one, which is involve your QA team. Guys, you're not off the hook. It's even though a lot of the testing is now going to be happening at the developer, the code development level. I think Q&A or QA needs to be as much a part of the process as it ever was. You know, if they're not doing the testing, they should be doing the advising.
Yeah, they should be
And
setting those best practices.
exactly, exactly.
Yeah,
I mean, they've got a totally different viewpoint, right? So, than developers do. So there's definitely something that they can add to the process. And you know, likewise, developers have you know, have certain things that they're thinking about as well. So I think having both the developers and QA involved in that testing process can really give a more comprehensive viewpoint of testing that otherwise would not be there.
yeah. And I think to your point earlier as well, everybody should be involved. I mean, QA plays a massive role in this, and they should absolutely be setting the best practices. But there's business rules. There's, you know, sort of, you know, everybody's got a certain goal for what, you know, a deployment will do for their respective part of the business. And I think that, you know, QA will ultimately drive the process. And yes, they do provide a good sort of, you know, subjective view or objective rather.
Yeah.
You know, the developer provides a very subjective view because they're in the code, they're doing their thing. The objective view would be, you know, more, you know, akin to, you know, aligning it with the, you know, the business value that's delivered by the deployment itself, and you know, being able to you know, look at it with fresh eyes. You know, a lot of times, you know, you may pick up on something that, you know, they may have, you know, missed you know, in the process. You know, this is why code reviews are still a big part of you know, the agile process, and that, you know, stand-ups and, you know, other, you know, meetings that happen on, you know, on a daily or even, you know, every other day kind of basis, you
Mhm.
know, will never be replaced. That it's very key to keep an open conduit of communication across all involved stakeholders. But yes, having the QA team involved is certainly you know, the way to go.
All right.
Yeah, agreed. I mean, I again, I'm looking at the ebook. Some of the really good information is compiled there,
It's
Mhm.
and
really
it talks
good,
about
really good.
yeah, yeah, and it talks about, you know, uh, this all about collaboration, right? The DevOps is all about collaboration, and so is continuous testing. And so, having the development team and QA team collaborate is very important. You know, QA teams could help set up the environment, you know, maintain the environment, help design the test cases, help provision the test data, help provision the virtual services. That all of those things are required to have a continuous testing in parallel and meet the time to market requirements that you have. So QA teams are, you know, are very critical to it. As the roles are changing, DevOps teams are doing testing some of the roles. Some new titles are coming up, like
Mhm.
SDET, Software Development Engineer in Test, for example.
Mhm.
You know, so the testers are learning to code, and developers are learning to test, and that's what we are talking about: collaboration, kind of coming together, having the skills that you know, development teams having testing skills, as well as testing team has a little bit of coding skills, but still the function of QA and the institutional knowledge is very important to make this whole continuous testing very efficient.
Okay, great.
Yeah.
Awesome, awesome. All right. Well, Ben, let's move on to the next slide. We've got some key takeaways here, and then I want to turn things over to you, Carl, so you can give a quick spiel on your company, and then also Anand can for his as well. But here are the kind of
Yeah.
the three major takeaways for the ebook that just a reminder, the audience is going to get a copy, just a link to download the ebook. So never fear if you're wondering just what the heck we're talking about. That's you'll get a copy of the ebook for your own. So continuous testing can help speed development by providing near instant feedback. That's what we're after, guys. But it's different from test automation, and it's not cutting QA out of the equation. So those are kind of, you know, three of the major takeaways, and then we've got the tips. But Ben, if you want to move on to the next slide, I'm going to turn it over to Carl so he can tell us a little bit about NS1.
All right. So NS1, we are the leader in next generation DNS solutions that orchestrate the delivery of the world's most critical internet and enterprise applications. Only NS1's purpose-built platform transforms DNS, a very old and fundamental protocol of the internet, into an intelligent, efficient, and automated stack system within your stack, driving dramatic gains in reliability, resiliency, security, and the performance of your application delivery infrastructure. We're built on a modern API-first architecture with an easy-to-use UX, precise routing controls, and a very great support team if you ever have to interact with them. So, we are a critical component of modern application delivery at enterprise scale. So we help enable, DevOps initiatives, IoT, data center migrations, and of course, as part of the testing stack, you have precision control over endpoints, so you can actually send a fraction of a percent of traffic to a certain endpoint as you're maybe turning up a new service to get real live data flowing into a system to make sure that it's working properly. So check us out, ns1.com, and of course you can always find me on LinkedIn, this Carl J. Levine, and on Twitter as Stuff Carl Says. Happy to talk shop over this stuff anytime.
All right, great. Okay, Ben, next slide, please. All right, Anand, you want to tell us more about Tricentis?
Sure. Tricentis is a continuous testing platform solution provider. We are a leader in the space by all the three key analysts, Gartner, Forrester, IDC, and we deliver actually most of the things that we talked about in the entire life cycle to help during the planning phase. We talked about risk-based testing. We offer that. We help you answer the question, does this release candidate have acceptable amount of risk? I have said that 15 times at least in this webinar. So hopefully when you go back and really think about asking this question, because it is very important that at the end of, especially when the softwares are getting developed and delivered very fast, you really need to answer that question. And test data management, service virtualization, functional testing for web, mobile, backend, SAP, Salesforce, exploratory testing we talked about, as well as performance testing. So complete end-to-end functional and load testing we offer. Our customers have seen twice risk coverage, release speed increasing by 2 to 3 times, and the cost reduction. And overall, if you look at the value, customers have seen more than 10 times of the value that they have been getting from their current solution. A lot of customers, 800 plus large enterprises using the tool. To name a few, WorldPay, Starbucks, there are a lot of companies in Europe and Americas, Australia, New Zealand that are using and benefiting from the continuous testing platform. And of course, you could learn more at tricentis.com. If you want to reach me, I'm available on Twitter, Akela.
All right. Awesome. All right. Well, thanks, guys. Ben, you want to move to the next slide? Okay, we are about 7 minutes to the top of the hour, so we can't take too many questions, but we'll try and get to as many as we can. Guys, one thing we didn't discuss is testing and containerization and kind of how that whole setup maybe is different. So I kind of want to briefly go over that and see if there are any differences in the way testing is approached using the containers. Carl, you want to go first?
If I'm honest, I've been out of the technical part of development for a couple of years now. So my knowledge of containerization is really just around the DNS space.
Okay.
So perhaps Anand could perhaps expand on this.
Yeah. Okay. Yeah, Anand.
Yeah, I mean, there are, as containers and Kubernetes and all these technologies becoming more and more important, there are a lot of different solutions that help in this area. I see that GitLab CEO has added some of his thoughts in the ebook. I mean, they are providing some solutions there. There are many solutions out there now that can help with giving you completed solution and first of all, kind of deliver their solution in containers, as well as testing solutions that are deployed on containers.
Okay. All right, great. Next question. What are some methodologies for executing early performance testing in a CI/CD environment? Thoughts there?
I mean, just setting the benchmarks early, just knowing what you're setting out to test, will make a massive difference in just how that's executed. The tools you would use, I mean, obviously, you got stuff like Tricentis out there. No plug for you, Anand. Maybe you'd like to, continue with that.
Yes. So a lot of people use, like open source tool like JMeter, Gatling, and so on to do their performance testing. And it's the continuous testing. The idea is to test sooner, test early, so they could use those. But if they want to kind of use their existing JMeter or Gatling test cases, but kind of take advantage of cloud and kind of generate the load from different parts of the world, there are tools like Tricentis Flood out there. There are other tools as well that they could use to kind of leverage their existing methodologies and scripts for performance test, doing performance testing in a distributed world earlier in their life cycle.
Okay. All right, great. Well, unfortunately, I think that's pretty much all the time that we have for Q&A, but I apologize if we didn't get to your question, but please know that Carl and Anand both will be receiving copies of the questions, so I'm sure either they or somebody from the organization will be more than happy to follow up with you post-event. I also want to remind the audience that today's event has been recorded, so if you missed any or all of it, or if you just want to listen to it again, please, you'll be receiving a link via email after the event that'll take you right to it, so feel free to listen at your leisure. The webinar is also going to be living on the DevOps.com website, so if you lose the link or whatever, you can always go to the DevOps.com website, look under the webinars tab, and it will be listed there in the on demand. And then also a reminder, everybody who registered for the event is getting a download link to the ebook, so you can follow along with your book if you want to listen to it again. But I do want to thank our panelists today, Ananda Kela and Carl Levine, for joining me. Thank you, gentlemen. What a great conversation. I really, really enjoyed it. I hope you guys enjoyed it as well. And I'd like to thank the audience for joining us as well. Without you, we wouldn't be here. So thanks so much. And this is Charlene O'Hanlon, and I am signing off. Have a great day, everybody.
Thanks, Charlene.
Thanks.
Thanks, Charlene.